Now that we're starting the National Register nomination, I want to start by focusing on Section 10, which is the geographic information, in part because you really need to know the edges of your district, the boundaries of your district, before you work on the rest. But also because this is some of the more technical parts of the NR nomination. The rest is mostly just writing. So it makes sense to focus on this first. So, um, as part of your NR nomination, you are going to include the following in Section 10 and in the graphic section. You're going to include a verbal boundary description, a verbal boundary justification, the coordinates of the boundaries of your district, a USGS map, a sketch map, a photo map, and a bunch of photos. I know that sounds like a lot, so we're going to break it down. In this first assignment that is due in a couple weeks, you're only going to include these following items: the verbal boundary description, the verbal boundary justification, the coordinates, and the sketch map. The rest of the stuff you will hand in with your NR nomination at the very end of the semester. Now, that said, in particular with the photos, do not wait. Go out and take the photos immediately or as soon as possible because obviously after Thanksgiving, we're not going to be on campus anymore, and you really need to take pictures in person. So there are 4 people in a team, so it should not be hard for you to take those pictures in person, but just a heads up, don't wait to do that stuff. So in this class, I'm going to explain to you all of these different bits and bobs for the geographical part of the NR nomination. And the first thing, I would argue the hardest thing, is how to choose your district boundaries, because this is really the only part of this where you're really making very value-laden decisions. Everything else is just, following directions. But this part, you have to actually make a decision as to what you want your district boundaries to be. So, this is an important task because, as I've mentioned like 25 times already, overlay zones are based on NR nominations. So, the Soho Cast Iron District in New York that you see above, that is a historic district, and the overlay zone lies right on top of it, right? So it is the justification for that overlay zone. So now they're proposing to actually expand it, though. Those are the lines you see coming out on both the top left and bottom right. And so it's a whole new process to try to include those properties as well. When you create a district, what you really need to do is make sure that that district follows zoning rules because, again, if it doesn't, then the zoning will have to be different than the NR nomination, and that makes for a problematic explanation of why it looks the way it does. So there's some things you need to avoid. For instance, you see that hook kind of in the middle of the, let's see if my cursor doesn't show here. There's a hook where the pink part comes up around Henry Clay Street. That's bad because then the people that are left out could say that that's arbitrary or discriminatory. And the people that are added to the district could also say that it's arbitrary or discriminatory. You want to avoid weird shapes as much as possible. You also want to make sure that your district is really well centered along whatever theme it is. So this is Cathedral Hill in Baltimore, and you'll notice that smack in the middle of it is the cathedral. And that makes sense, right? You want your district to follow whatever theme it is. So in our case, Normandy Village, what is the theme of it? What is its essence? You really want to focus on that to figure out what the boundaries are. You also want to be very careful with those boundaries. Make sure that they really, really make sense. So you'll notice that this one in Fells Point, also in Baltimore, cuts off part of the waterfront. Now, there doesn't seem to be anything built on there, but that could have an impact later on in terms of funding, in terms of potentially Section 106, that kind of stuff. So you want to make sure you make your boundaries really good. Like, think about them carefully. Here's another great example. This is just outside of Washington, D.C. It's Tacoma Park in Maryland. And you'll notice that this district kind of looks weird because it has a linear part along Carroll Avenue, and then it has the rest of it, which seems to, kind of follow the boundary of Washington, D.C. And that's because Carroll Avenue is actually a commercial corridor, and then the rest of it is a residential neighborhood. And what really should have happened is that they had created two different historic districts. Because as it is, there's no theme to bring the two historic districts together other than the fact that they're close to each other. And so generally you really want to avoid that, right? Because then again, it weakens your argument. Why is this a historic district, right? You want to be able to say it's a historic district because, as simply as possible. Here are 3 historic districts in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and by and large, they're fine, except for the Cameron McCauley Historic District. You'll notice that that historic district has a weird tomahawk shape at the bottom, where it narrows down to the road and then expands back out. And again, that will become very problematic when this becomes an overlay zone, if this becomes an overlay zone. So you really want to avoid it. So either include the property above to make that line straighter, or take out those properties. But don't leave this weird shape. Weird shapes like this are really, really bad. Right. So this illustration, I know it's hard to see because of the topo lines, but this illustration, I think, explains one of the decisions you have to make when you make a historic district. So if you see even where the topo lines are kind of in the middle top, there's actually a ton of properties that are non-contributing, that are in the district, right? So they're left in the district even though there's a bunch of them that are non-contributing. And the line at the top is straight across that arterial. Now, that's a fine decision to make. Another okay decision to make would have been to leave out whatever that big, like octagonal or hexagonal building is at the top, and have the line come down and exclude all of those non-contributing buildings. Either is okay, but you need to justify your decision. So if that octagonal or whatever shaped building at the top is really important, then yeah, you have to keep it. Or if maybe that boundary of the district was important at a certain point, then you have to keep it, even though it means you have fewer contributing, or I should say more non-contributing buildings in the district. So you have to make a decision, right? Do you include more non-contributing buildings, or do you potentially exclude one contributing building and figure out what decision you want to make? Here's another example. Generally okay, except for the fact that it cuts into that road at the bottom right. That's not good. You don't want to do that. And if you hand in something like this, I will automatically fail you. I mean, this is terrible. Notice those weird shapes where it includes a couple properties, and like this is just a lawsuit waiting to happen. So don't do that. So all this to say that you need to decide what you want to include in your district and what you want to exclude from your district. And making that decision is something that you should do as a team. Take your time. Do not rush it. Do not make this difficult on yourself by going too quickly and then regretting your decision. So take your time, look at the map, figure out what you want to include, what you want to exclude, and think carefully why. Why are you including? Why are you excluding? Is it to avoid weird shapes? Is it to include as many types of buildings as you can? Or, is it to make sure that you get all of the ranch houses, but as few of the other ones as you can? Whatever you want to do is okay, but you want to be able to explain it. You want to be able to justify it. So, in addition to a map, which we'll talk about in a bit, you do need to describe your verbal boundary. In regular properties, if you're just doing a single house, this is a very easy task, right? Because it's a rectangle usually, and so that means it's 4 turns and it's easy peasy. In our case, with a district, it's actually quite complicated because lots of districts have lots of jagged edges. So it's super important to have a good verbal boundary description, especially because sometimes the map gets misplaced. So it's important to have that redundancy of the verbal description. When you do your verbal boundary description, you want to be specific and use only permanent features. You also can choose to use the cardinal points or left, right, but don't use both. So either say turn north here, turn east here, or say turn right here, turn left here, but don't use both. Don't mix them up because that's just really, really confusing. So let me show you a really bad one first. Beginning on the Ridge Road 100 feet south of the house A, thence west 200 feet, north 200 feet, east 200 feet to the road, thence along the middle of the road south 4,900 feet, thence around the house B, west 200, north 200, east 200. It keeps going like that. The point is the boundaries here, you'll notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 properties, and the line just goes out to each of the houses and then goes back to the road, which is, first of all, a terrible district, and second of all, a terrible description of that district. If you're going to use turns like that, you want to make sure to start at a point and be clear where the boundary goes. So let me give you a couple other examples, one of them slightly better and one of them much worse. The Fairmount District is bound by Meyer Street on the north, Commercial Street on the east, by Luther Street on the south, extending along a line between lots through the block between Saginaw and Commercial Streets, and by John Street on the west, extending along a line between lots from Lincoln to Meyer Street. The district is contained in the 1871 Myers addition to Salem, replatted in 1889 as the Fairmount Park addition to Salem. So this first one is generally okay. The last sentence is completely unnecessary and should not be in this description. It's not describing. This is about the history. This has nothing to do with the description. It should not be in the verbal boundary description. The rest of it, though, is pretty good. By the way, your boundary can go between properties. So it's okay to not necessarily follow streets, to follow behind properties, but you cannot cross a property line. So you can go around a property line, right? Follow a property line, but you can't just cut a property in half. That's not allowable. All right, a really terrible example. The Washington Avenue Historic District encompasses all of the residential and monumental properties that face onto Washington Avenue and that are located roughly between Lewis Street on the south and Maryball Street on the north. The exact boundaries of the district are noted on the accompanying map. No, you can't do that. The whole point of this description is to describe what's there in case the map gets lost or something. So you must describe it point by point. So if you're doing a rough rectangle, you can do, basically follow the example of the one at the top, right? Is say on the north, it follows this line. On the south, it follows this line. On the east, it follows this line. On the west, it follows this line. The other alternative is to start wherever the corner is that you want to start, right? So say the boundary line begins at the corner of College and William Streets. Thence the boundary line, again, it's the boundary line, it's not you, it's the boundary line, follows along College Avenue until it reaches, Pelham Street. Then it turns west and follows Pelham Street until it reaches Augustine Street. Thence it turns north and follows Augustine Street, and keep going like that until you get back to the beginning point. So either of those ways to do it is okay. It really is going to depend on the shape of your district. So the more turns there are, obviously, the harder it is to do one of these things. But I can tell you how I'm going to grade these is I'm going to take a map without anything but the street names, and I'm going to follow your directions from your verbal boundary description. And if it forms the same shape as your map, then you did a good job. If it doesn't form the same shape as your map, then you messed up, and you will be graded accordingly. All right, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to go on to the verbal boundary justification. Oops. Escape. There we go.